Now we're moving on to el verbo sentir, which is used to convey feelings and emotions. And the verb sentir, which means to feel, is used in a non-reflexive way and in a reflexive way, which can make it a bit confusing. But in the next section, we're going to cover both the reflexive and non-reflexive ways that the verb sentir is used. We're going to begin with the verb sentir, which means to feel, in its non-reflexive form. The first thing to know is that the verb sentir is what we call a stem changer, which means that the verb changes when it's conjugated at the beginning of the word, okay? In this specific case, our stem changes from E to IE. So as we go through all of the examples, I want to make sure that you pay attention to where that stem change happens and occurs, because it's not throughout the whole conjugation chart, which we will review in the next section. So here we go. Yo siento el sol means I feel the sun. Notice how the conjugation changes to an IE at the beginning of the verb. Yo siento el sol. Tú sientes el sol means you feel the sun. Él siente el sol. Ella siente el sol mean he and she feel the sun, and usted siente el sol means you, formal, feel the sun. Now, notice how in first and second person plural, the stem goes back to its original form in the infinitive. So, nosotros sentimos, there is absolutely no stem change there, means we feel. So nosotros sentimos el sol means we feel the sun. Vosotros sentís el sol means you all feel the sun. And then third person plural goes back to its stem change. Ellos, ellas, ustedes sienten el sol, which means they, both masculine and feminine, and you all feel the sun. Now, because the verb sentir is a stem changer, there are certain rules which we have to follow. One of them is that the stem only occurs on the first person singular yo form, the second person singular tú form, and the third person singular el, ella, usted form, and the third person plural ellos, ellas, and ustedes forms. Now you're going to notice that nosotros and vosotros, which are the first person plural and second person plural, never change stem. So those follow the regular conjugations and stem of the infinitive of the verb sentir. So you notice nosotros sentimos, vosotros sentís. There is no stem change in the first person plural and second person plural conjugations of any of the verbs, stem changing verbs in Spanish. They always revert back to the original stem of the infinitive form of the verb. I think the best way to remember this is that in the present tense only, de nosotros and vosotros do not change stem, ever. One of the best ways to determine when to use the verb sentir in its non-reflexive or reflexive form is to ask yourself whether the action is reflected upon the subject or the object. We use the verb sentir non-reflexively, meaning in its regular form, when the action is not reflected upon one's self, but instead when it's reflected on the object. We're going to take a deep look at this. So when you have a sentence like, yo siento la aguja de la jeringa, which means I feel the needle of the syringe, the object is aguja or syringe or needle. And that receives the action of the feeling. So therefore, it's the object. It answers the what. So therefore, we use the verb sentir in its regular form. With the next sentence, we do the same thing. El doctor siente mi cabeza. The object here is cabeza. This means the doctor feels my head. So the head is the object, okay? And since the object is cabeza, it's receiving the action of the feeling. And it's also answering the what. What is the doctor feeling? He's feeling my head. So then we know to use the verb in a non-reflexive way because it's not reflecting the action back upon one's self. Now we're going to take a look at the verb sentir, but in its reflexive form. So we know how to identify the verb sentir when it's reflexive because it has an SE attached to it. So sentirse is actually to feel one's self. Okay, to feel in a reflexive manner. Because it's a reflexive verb, it's going to follow all of the same stem changing rules as the regular verb. However, it's going to require the use of what we call reflexive pronouns. The reflexive pronouns always go before the conjugation of the verb or before the conjugated verb. So for example, yo me siento estresado o estresada means I feel stressed. Tú te sientes estresado o estresada means you feel stressed. Él, ella se siente estresado o estresada means he or she feels stressed. And then usted se siente estresado o estresada means you, formal, feel stressed. Now, we're going to go back to the non-stem change with the first person plural and second person plural. Nosotros nos sentimos estresados o estresadas means we feel stressed. Vosotros os sentís estresados, estresadas means you or y'all feel stressed. Ellos, ellas, and ustedes se sienten estresados, estresadas means means they, masculine and feminine plural, feel stressed, and you, plural, feel stressed. So in order to understand this a little further, we need to remember that when we use a verb in its reflexive form, the action is reflected upon one's self or the subject, but not the object. Okay? So for example, in a sentence like yo me siento mal, which means I feel sick or I feel unwell, the subject is yo and the reflexive pronoun me is directing the action of the feeling back to oneself or back to the subject, okay? In the second example, el doctor se siente bien, which means the doctor feels well, the subject is the doctor, and the reflexive pronoun se is directing the action of the feeling back to one's self. And that is the main difference between the use of the verb sentir in its regular form and the use of the verb sentirse in its reflexive form. So here are some examples. Ella siente su azúcar baja. This sentence means she feels her sugar is low. Notice that there is no reflexive pronoun, so therefore we're not using the verb in a reflexive way. It's just saying she feels her sugar is low. It's not saying she feels herself that her sugar is low. It's just saying she feels her sugar is low. Then we have the use of the verb sentirse. Ella se siente orgullosa means she feels proud, or really she feels proud of herself. Therefore, there is that reflexive pronoun se, which is reflecting the action back to one's self or the subject. Now here are more examples. Más ejemplos. La enfermera siente el pulso del paciente. The nurse feels the pulse of the patient. Here we have the verb sentir used in a non-reflexive way. The nurse feels the pulse. What does the nurse feel? The pulse. So the pulse is the object. Okay, the action is not upon one's self. Now, in the next example, la paciente se siente mareada means the patient feels dizzy. It really means the patient feels herself dizzy. So the action of the feeling is reflected back onto the subject of one's self, okay? So in this case, this is why we use the reflexive pronoun se and the verb sentir in a reflexive manner, because it's directed back to one's self.